Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's August 10th, 2024, and before we get into today's topics, I want to circle back and catch one aspect of some survey data that we reviewed last week that didn't catch my attention the first time through, and it was with regards to the Democratic attack on the Trump ticket with J.D. Vance in particular, where the new term of phrase that was spontaneously or seemingly spontaneously yet simultaneously agreed upon to be the point of attack against J.D. Vance by calling him weird and by calling the Trump supporters and the Trump campaign weird. And we noted how odd that was, given that to the extent that it was a derogatory term at all, it was one that applied much more to people on the left generally. It was more the self-conception to some extent, in a self-deprecating way, that people on the left gave to themselves, and it was more a point of attack that would normally come from the right. And we saw that in the data from YouGov that showed that self-identified Democrats and independents were much more likely to perceive themselves as being, or describe themselves as being, weird than Republicans or conservatives were. And also that younger people were more likely to describe as weird than older people, and that women were more likely to just self-describe as being weird than men. And so it seemed like all of these Democratic constituencies were the ones who had more personal affinity for the term weird. And so to level what they described themselves as more than their opponents as a point of attack against their opponents seemed curious, to say the least. But I did fail to mention the racial dynamics vis-a-vis the term weird. Whites, 49% self-describe as weird, while just 36% of blacks do, and 47% of Hispanics. So whites are the most likely to self-describe as weird, while blacks are the least likely to, with Hispanics marginally less likely to than whites, but the Hispanic-white difference is negligible. Blacks, however, stand out as being much less likely than other racial groups to self-describe as weird. And so in the context of the Trump attack against Harris being authentically black, and in light of the observations by many skeptical or critical of the Harris campaign that prior to her entry into national politics at the level of the presidential campaigns in 2020 and now in 2024, prior to that, she had primarily self-identified and emphasized her South Asian heritage. She is about 25% sub-Saharan African by ancestry, and additionally is not a descendant of slaves in the United States. And so that lack of homegrown authenticity as a member of the, quote, black community, unquote, coupled with the fact that her political career up until 2020 was relegated to the state of California, which is much less black than the nation at large, led to a situation that did not incentivize her emphasis on her black cultural and racial heritage. And that lack of authenticity, or perceived lack of authenticity, and by extension the perceived coolness that black voters will feel towards candidates who are not authentically viewed as being black organically in an American context, is prone to being exaggerated. I'm looking at a YouGov Economist poll from the late fall of 2019, when the 2020 primary debates on the Democratic side had begun to occur, but none of the primaries or caucuses has taken place. They were still a couple of months out. Biden at the time was leading the pack with 27% of support among Democrats and independents who intended to vote in the primaries or caucuses. Harris, in contrast, was at a distant fifth place with 4% of total support. Notably, among blacks, Biden had 47% of black support, but Harris had 9%. She was tied with Elizabeth Warren for second place among blacks, even though she was a distant fifth place overall. Her black support was more than twice that, almost 3 times that of her non-black support. Cory Booker, who was also running at the time, had 2% of black support. And without digging too deeply into his history, because my pain tolerance has its limits, at a quick glance, he looks to be about as ancestrally sub-Saharan African as Harris, if not modestly more so. And of course, both of them are infinitely more racially and ethnically black than Joe Biden, and yet Joe Biden had black support and by extension had the nomination nailed down from the get-go. Because to the extent that there is any democratic process that takes place in the nominating process for the Democrat Party, there is no obtaining the top of the ticket without garnering a majority of black support. Obama showed that back in 2008 when he won 85% of black Democratic primary and caucus support, even while Hillary Clinton beat him among whites and among Hispanics and among Asians. It's something that is often lost in the sauce of the upset that was the 2008 Democratic primary. Had Obama just won blacks 2-1 instead of winning them 5-1 as he did, he wouldn't have become the 44th president of the United States, and Joe Biden would not have become the 46th. Anyway, the intention of this long digression is to highlight another instance of that heuristic that we keep referring to again and again from Thomas Sowell of white liberals and black rednecks. Because on the weird spectrum, at the maximally weird end, we have white liberals, the ones Christian Lander wrote about in the aughts with the book entitled Stuff White People Like. That gave rise to the term swipple that isn't in much use now, but was quite prominent about a decade ago. And then in the middle of the weirdness spectrum, we have white conservatives and white traditionalists. And then at the other end of the weirdness spectrum, where those who are not weird and do not embrace the description and instead recoil from it, are blacks. Overwhelmingly Democrat, overwhelmingly liberal by political orientation, but distinctly not weird by comparison. And so if we want to give the Harris campaign and their corporate media stenographers the benefit of the doubt, we could look at this as a sort of double bank shot way of shoring up support among blacks. And permit me a digression from a digression before we get back to the topics that we want to talk about today. In looking at the polling data, digging through it to try to find 2020 Democratic presidential campaign polling results prior to dropouts and major state contests taking place, I came across a survey that asked about whether certain things were anti-Semitic or not, and one of them was a question posed to respondents if it was anti-Semitic to, quote, deny the historical fact of the Holocaust, unquote. By race, 74% of whites say it is inherently anti-Semitic to deny the Holocaust, 52% of Hispanics, and just 43% of blacks. So only a minority of blacks assert that it is inherently anti-Semitic to deny the historicity of the Holocaust. 71% of Democrats said that it was anti-Semitic, and 70% of Republicans. And of course, Democrats are less white than Republicans, and with the black number pulling that overall Democratic number down, we again have a white liberals, black redneck situation where white Democrats are the most likely to view any skepticism of what occurred among European Jewry in the 1940s as anti-Semitic, while white Republicans and white independents are in the middle of the distribution, and non-whites more generally and blacks in particular are at the most skeptical end of the distribution when it comes to perceiving any sort of questions about the Holocaust as being inherently anti-Semitic. And while I'd now like to reclinate back to the start of the podcast, I can't get away from weird, that term, because much in the same way as Trump appropriated the term fake news during the 2016 presidential cycle, because if you'll remember, that was initially a term of attack that was employed against Trump. He was the one who was propagating fake news, and he, as the pickup artist would say, agreed and amplified the term, but turned around its meaning to throw it back at those who were directing it towards him, to such an extent that the corporate media that had birthed the term in the first place quickly came to want to have the term aborted. And presumably the brain trust in the Trump campaign couldn't believe their luck when the attack of Weird paired with the Harris campaign tapping Minnesota Governor Tim Walz to be the vice presidential nominee. This is a guy obsessed with figuratively filleting the alphabet people to the absurd extent of having tampon dispensers put in men's restrooms, boys' restrooms in Minnesota public schools. Something that is not going to tend to put it mildly, ingratiate him to potentially skeptical black voters. And the Trump campaign wasted no time in attempting to capitalize on this.
What could be weirder than signing a bill into law that requires schools to stock tampons in boys' bathrooms? Or weirder than signing legislation allowing minors to receive sex change operations? Try electing the man who signed those bills Vice President of the United States. Enter Chief Weirdo Tim Walz. As governor of Minnesota, Walz supported legislation that endangers minors, hurts women, and puts radical ideology ahead of common sense. Now Kamala wants Walz to enforce those laws on a national scale. Tim Walz, too weird, too radical.
Rhetorically, that is likely to be effective, especially with regards to dampening potential black support for Walz. It's worth noting, too, how questions like this, issues like tampons in boys' rooms, is a phenomenon that can only manifest itself in weird or weirdo countries, and I use that as an acronym rather than a term of derision as it was referenced previously. Weird in this case is the acronym, I believe, first coined by Jonathan Haidt to help Westerners conceptualize how the Western moral framework, while ubiquitous or previously ubiquitous in the Western world, in Europe and its diaspora, was a moral framework that most of the rest of the world was skeptical of, if not outright hostile to. And so the acronym was Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, Democratic. WEIRD, weird. And it's a nice double entendre because the acronym describes the major demographic and cultural characteristics of Westerners who are a global minority, but whose cultural imperialism often leads those in the West to presume that it is globally a cultural disposition shared by the majority of the world's populations. And I cheekily added an O to that acronym to stand for outbred. So Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, Democratic, and Outbred, weirdo, because people of Northwestern European descent tend to be the most outbred, among the most outbred populations on the planet. And what we mean by outbred in this context is not married to close family members. This is something the dissident right was screaming into the void about 25 years ago ahead of the Iraq invasion. There was no way any sort of liberal, democratic, cultural and political system would ever take hold in a place like Iraq where about 50% of the population is married to a second cousin or closer. If the terms like second cousin, third cousin get confusing, an easy way to think about it is to look at shared grandparents. So a first cousin is someone that you share a grandparent with. A second cousin is someone that you share a great-grandparent with. A third cousin is someone you share a great-great-grandparent with. A sibling, of course, is someone you share a parent with. And so you can see the degrees of separation genetically going up as we go from first cousin to second cousin to third cousin. But second cousin is pretty closely related, and even more closely related if that shared great-grandparent also married a second cousin or a first cousin. Those sorts of family structures create very tribalistic, closed systems of loyalty, and those sorts of social dynamics do not lend themselves well to the functioning of a liberal democracy as it is imagined in the West. And though it's a generation too late, it is interesting to note that Gavin McInnes recently pointed that out on the Joe Rogan podcast. So the weird angle seems rhetorically more effective than going the anti-Semitic route as a means of attacking Walls, on account that him not being Josh Shapiro somehow indicates that the Harris administration would not be sufficiently pro-Israel. While the belief that a politician is not sufficiently pro-Israel can be devastating to that politician's career, as we saw this week in the case of Cori Bush being knocked off by a very pro-Israel progressive, much in the mold of Tim Walz, albeit a black version of Walz. The problem with that line of attack against Walz, that he is anti-Semitic, simply is going to be one that is rhetorically very easy for the Harris campaign to dispel, because there's nothing in Walz's history in Congress or as governor that would indicate he deviates in any way on the pro-Israel neoliberal corporatist line of the mainstream of the Democrat Party. And so all the Trump campaign attacking Walz on his presumed weakness in terms of support for Israel will do is provide ample opportunity for the Harris campaign and for Walz to proclaim their support for Israel, but in a way that's a little less strident and a little bit more rhetorically nuanced than the Republican Party's political elite. None of the power players behind the scenes that watch these things very closely are going to be fooled into thinking that either Harris or Walz or anyone on their campaign is hostile to Israel's interests. But lower information voters are those who pay less close attention to the ins and outs of these things, who for reasons of anti-colonialism sentiments or anti-white sentiments are instinctively pro-Palestinian and skeptical of Israel. Those types will see the Trump campaign attacks on Walz as being too pro-Israel as a potential sign that, hey, he's not as bad as, quote, Genocide Joe, unquote, and this shifts, his nomination shifts some sort of, or signals some sort of shift in the Democratic Party's orientation towards the conflict in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinians and Hezbollah and Iran. And so politically calling Walz a weirdo makes a lot more sense than calling him anti-Semitic, and by extension implying that the Harris campaign is somehow anti-Semitic. Harris's husband, Doug Emhoff, is stridently Zionist. He is himself Jewish. About half of the top of the Biden administration cabinet is Jewish and pro-Israel and Zionist. And so trying to attack them on that front when it is a front that causes some dissension in the ranks of the core Democratic Party constituencies is politically self-defeating, especially in light of the fact that those power players who work behind the scenes, who are concerned about Israel, know the score with regard to Walz and the Harris campaign, and so are not in any way going to be fooled into thinking that Walz is a bad bet, but instead are going to be pleased that the Trump campaign is allowing some rhetorical cover to get the anti-Israel constituencies of the Democratic Party in line to vote for the Harris-Walz ticket. And again, Cori Bush's primary defeat in Missouri shows to the inner party that they are still able to comfortably get what they want vis-a-vis the Middle East without having to seriously contend with the relatively restrained foreign policy confines of the ascendant America First movement on the Republican side of things. If you're a member of the managerial class and you're concerned about the continued viability of the military-industrial complex, thinking that the choice might be between the Democrat Party, who is happy to keep the weapons gravy train going in Central Europe by supporting Ukraine indefinitely against Russia, but who might have some hesitations about continuing to fund Israel's wars, expanding wars in the Middle East, and the Republicans who want things to dry up in Ukraine but are willing to indefinitely fund Israel in the Middle East. Well, those fears are being allayed to a large extent because the Democrats will continue to fund Ukraine while also continuing to indefinitely fund Israel. And so with Republicans, you get war in the Middle East. With Democrats, you get war in the Middle East and in Ukraine. And so you go with the Democrats. You don't really have a decision to make any longer. And that doesn't bode well for the chances of the insurgency elite contingent led by guys like Elon Musk and David Sachs and Bill Ackman, who are willing to make a sort of compromise with the America First energies animating the right half of the grassroots of the American electorate. A compromise that says, if you continue to give us Israel, we will pull back in the rest of our globe-trotting cultural imperialist empire. Shifting away from rhetoric and more towards the underlying sentiments that drive human action in the political and cultural spheres, let's take a look at some YouGov economist data released this week, asking respondents how they perceive Harris and Trump in terms of the care that those two candidates are perceived to have for the, quote, needs and problems of, unquote, various groups of major American demographics. Particularly, I want to focus on how Trump supporters view the groups that Harris cares most about and how Harris voters view the groups that Trump cares about. In a political system increasingly defined by the friend-enemy distinction, where your guy is good and their guy is bad, not just in terms of the effectiveness or lack thereof of various policy prescriptions, but on a much more morally visceral level. Well, that bad opposition candidate, whoever they care about, those people are also presumably bad by extension, or at least are highly suspect. And so it's not unreasonable to view the groups that Trump voters think Harris cares a lot about are groups that the MAGA movement perceives to be adversarial, and conversely, groups that Harris supporters believe that Trump cares about are correspondingly seen among the left broadly defined to be enemies of progress and on the wrong side of history. 47% of Trump voters perceive Harris to care either a lot or some about the needs and problems of women, while just 14% of Trump supporters feel that Harris cares about men. And so a way to read this is that women are viewed as more of an obstacle to the MAGA movement than men are. And as we go through these, we'll see that none of these are particularly surprising, but it's nice to have them quantified. As I'm trying to articulate this, I think a better way, a more clear way to think about this would be, instead of viewing those as obstacles to the MAGA movement, to view them as, or to view these results as indicative of how Trump supporters perceive hostility coming from the Harris campaign, particularly, and the left half of America more generally. And so as we go through these results, that's the tact I'm going to take. I think that clarifies more than the initial way that I approached it. And so with 47% of Trump supporters thinking that Harris cares about women, while just 14% believe that she cares about men, show that the MAGA movement's perception is that the Harris campaign and the left half of America more generally is much more hostile towards men than towards women. Specifically, hostile towards the, quote, needs and problems, unquote, of these groups. And because, of course, the left, broadly defined, is culturally ascendant, culturally dominant in the American context and in the Western context more generally, we will find that the groups that the right thinks Harris and the left does not care about are groups that you are not permitted to express explicit concern for without major risks to your social standing and your status. That checks out immediately here with the differences in perception of the left's concern about the needs and problems of women versus men. It is perfectly socially acceptable to bring up the issues and concerns and problems that women face, but to focus on the issues and problems that men face is considered taboo. By race, we have Trump supporters, 38% of Trump supporters saying Harris cares about Black Americans, 21% about Asian Americans, and 15% about white Americans. Unfortunately, the survey doesn't ask about Hispanics. I presume that Hispanics would come between blacks and Asians, but blacks are by far the group that are perceived to be cared about the most, and then Asians, and then whites. And again, if we think about that in terms of which groups you are explicitly allowed to care about, blacks are the most acceptable to care about. Asians explicitly less so than blacks, but more so than whites, and of course, white Americans, the group that you are least able to show concern for and advocate for without running into problems. Looking next at how Harris voters perceive Trump with regards to caring about the, quote, needs and problems, unquote, of the sexes and the races, we can interpret the groups that Harris voters think Trump cares about as groups that are fair game for attack, for being named explicitly as a threat and as an obstacle. For women, it is just 10% of Harris voters asserting that Trump cares, compared to 68% of Harris voters saying Trump cares about men. Again, this checks out. Of course, it is far more acceptable to talk about the problems that men create than it is to talk about the problems that women pose to society. By race, it's even starker. Just 9% of Harris supporters say that Trump cares about blacks. Only 7% say he cares about Asians, but 74% say he cares about whites. Once more, little surprise here. It is totally acceptable to talk about the problems that whites create, the damage they do, the obstacles they present to society and to progress, etc., while it is unacceptable to single out blacks or Asians for the same sort of criticism. And to the anticipated potential objection that this reading of the data suggests that it is marginally more acceptable to criticize blacks than it is to criticize Asians, I push back and say that probably is true insofar as the breakdown of the black family and the problems of inner city dysfunction and crime are not totally unheard of subjects on the left. Of course, they're couched in different language than what was employed by the mainstream right, let alone the dissident right. They are issues that at least have some salience, some cultural salience, whereas problems created by Asians in America, to the extent that they exist at all, are not really talked about at all in culturally acceptable corporate discourse. So we've talked about Trump and talked about Harris, and we've picked on Walz, but we've pretty much left J.D. Vance out of the discussion. We'll rectify that now by looking at an issue that has come to be associated with Vance in particular with regards to the 2024 presidential election cycle. And I think this is probably the most important issue in terms of the existential future of the human race, to not be too overly dramatic about it. And that is on the question of fertility. YouGov asked earlier this week respondents about how they perceived births in the United States to be going. Are too many children being born in the United States? Not enough children being born in the United States? Is the Goldilocks about the right number of children being born? The official total fertility rate in the United States is 1.7 children per woman, while absent migration, a rate of just over 2 is required for population replenishment. So at the current rates, the United States population will, after the boomer generation dies off, will begin to enter a long decline in the American population, a trend that is already underway in multiple American states. Overall, 23% of Americans say that too many children are being born, 22% say that not enough children are being born, and 27% say the right number of children are being born, while the residual 29% say they are unsure. So we have a situation where on net, Americans tend to think that our fertility is about where it should be. There are pretty stark differences by sex, however. Among men, 19% say that too many children are being born, while 30% say not enough, and 28% about the right number. Women, in contrast, 26% say too many children are being born, just 14% say not enough, and 27% say about the right number. So in the case of men, by almost a 2-to-1 margin, men are concerned that not enough children are being born, while in contrast, women, by a 2-to-1 margin, think that too many children are being born in the United States. By race, whites are the most concerned about low American fertility rates, with 22% of whites saying too many children are being born, while 25% say not enough, and 27% about the right number. Blacks, in comparison, 23% say too many children are being born, just 10% say not enough are being born, 33% about the right amount. Hispanics, 27% say too many children are being born, 16% say not enough, and 25% about the right amount. So whites are almost at parity, with a modest lean in the direction of not enough children being born compared to too many children being born, but by more than 2-to-1 ratio, blacks say that too many children are being born. And with Hispanics, it's about the same, a little less than 2-to-1, say too many children are being born, but almost that same rate. So if you're a person of poor taste, you can make a quip about how, blacks have black children. And so it's not surprising that by more than 2-to-1 margin, they think that too many children are being born. And if you look at adoption queues, the wait list for black babies who are put up for adoption, the wait list for them to find adoptive parents is measured in years and even decades. They often spend a majority, or if not the entirety, of their adolescence in the foster care system, because the sad reality is there are way more black babies up for adoption, black kids up for adoption, than there are people who want to adopt them. While the wait list to adopt white kids is in the opposite direction, where those who want to adopt white children, white babies, have to wait for years and often decades for available babies to be adopted to come up for them to adopt. The supply of black babies greatly outstrips the demand, while the supply of white babies is not nearly large enough to satisfy the demand. I don't think that's the only prism through which these results should be interpreted or should be considered through, but it is a factor, and one that could potentially help understand the racial differences in perceptions of the birth dearth problem, such that it is perceived to be a problem at all. By political orientation, this would be an instance where the white liberals, black rednecks heuristic does not hold. Democrats, 27% say that too many children are being born, just 11% say not enough children being born, with 35% saying the right amount. Among independents, it's 22% saying too many, 24% not enough, 20% the right amount. Among Republicans, 19% saying too many children being born, 30% say not enough, and 28% the right amount. So by a nearly 3-to-1 margin, American Democrats say that too many Americans are being born, while in contrast, by an almost 2-to-1 margin, Republicans say that not enough children are being born in the United States. And among independents, the views are split just about evenly. And so Vance's advocacy for fecundity among Americans and the left's general hostility to that advocacy meshes well with the results that we see here. Most concerningly, for those who perceive there to be a fertility problem facing the United States, by generational cohort, we see the groups, the generations who are able to have children at this point in time being the least sympathetic to the idea that not enough children are being born, while it's the boomers who perceive a fertility problem in the United States. Among Zoomers, 22% say too many children are being born, compared to 17% saying not enough, with 30% saying about the right amount. Among millennials, 25% say too many, 18% say not enough, 29% the right amount. Gen Z, it's 24% too many, 24% not enough, 24% about the right amount. Among boomers, 19% say too many children are being born, 28% not enough, and 27% about the right number. So, though it's not by overwhelming margins, among Zoomers and millennials, the cohorts currently capable of copulating and procreating tend towards thinking, if anything, there's too much of that going on, while the boomers fret rather impotently about not having grandchildren of their own. All right, that'll do it for us today. We'll talk to you next time.